Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being with us today to talk about an important issue, and certainly for kicking off in a theme that I'm hoping will set the trajectory for the rest of the day. So, Jarredine, let me begin with you. Obviously, we look at the updates and the latest updates, and I think that'll be a nice starting point for us. What are the latest updates on South Africa's carbon tax regulations, and how do they compare to global trends?
Great, thank you. So the latest updates are perhaps a little bit of a non-update, actually. So maybe just to set the scene, South Africa is one of around 89 jurisdictions with a compliance-based carbon pricing mechanism in place. So in our case, that's the carbon tax. Our tax is levied across all greenhouse gas emissions, so the majority of emissions in the economy. Other countries opt to only tax certain sectors, perhaps, or certain emissions. The global average carbon price is around $23 per metric ton of carbon. And South Africa's is well below that at around $10 per metric ton. We also have various allowances in the carbon tax in South Africa, and so that means that companies who have to pay the carbon tax can also qualify for between 60 and 95% of that tax as a free allowance. So the effective rate ends up being much, much lower. National Treasury had proposed under a discussion paper that they issued for phase 2, they had proposed to do away with some of the various allowances or to shrink them for the second phase, along with increasing that effective rate of tax. And so that would have made our tax a lot more in line with these international prices. But when the minister published the belated budget speech, many of the allowances and that were retained for the carbon tax. So we do have the headline rate increasing to about the equivalent of $13 per metric ton, but many of those allowances are still in place, which makes our carbon tax quite low and ineffectual in terms of driving change, unfortunately. I think one of the biggest things there is around the extension of price neutrality on electricity. So that's great news for end customers. It means that cost is not passed on to us, which would currently be the case. But we are generating our power from coal, from fossil fuels, produces our greatest emissions. And so having a carbon tax instrument that doesn't actually address that means that there's no driver to change that behavior in the sense of a carbon price.
Yeah. Okay. So the really interesting statistics that you're giving us and setting it. But Mohsin, let me come to you. How can South African industries transition from viewing carbon tax as a compliance burden to actually leveraging it as a strategic advantage?
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. From my perspective, phase 1 is expected to run up to the end of 2025 with respect to carbon taxes. And that was always intended to be a soft entry for businesses within the broader economy. And phase 1 includes allowances that, as you've mentioned now, it significantly reduces the cost of the effective rate for carbon taxes to the point of just around an average 10 to 15%. In a developing country like ours, it's especially crucial that we don't have any major shocks to the system. Phase 2, however, which is expected from 2026 onwards, that does represent a marked shift in terms of the impact to businesses. And in my mind, there's about potentially 3 points which I'll touch on.
Please.
Firstly, incorporation of climate as part of an organization's broader strategy, looking at climate reduction strategies, investment in clean technology, preparing for regulatory updates in terms of local and global policies. And locally, carbon tax is always premised on the polluter pays principle. But businesses will ultimately look to pass that on to consumers. I mean, it's just interesting with the latest NERSA decision on Eskom's application for the tariff. Eskom actually applied to pass on carbon tax costs to the end users, being us. And I think with phase 2 coming on, there's a reduction in allowances, as it's been mentioned, an increase in the carbon tax rate, and businesses will likely find themselves with significantly higher operating costs. So on the one hand, you could use that as your advantage to outprice competitors, but if you lag behind in the medium term, especially so, you could find yourself out of business as well. Now, from an international perspective as well, you've got jurisdictions such as the EU moving towards greener initiatives such as your Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, and that's coming on from January 2026, and it impacts sectors such as your steel manufacturing sectors, particularly for South Africans, which then does again also increase operating costs in the environment. Now, the EU is one of our largest trading partners. It's a key source of foreign direct investment when you think of the automotive sector. And again, what I think you mentioned yesterday, and I think everybody in the room knows that our relationship with the US is a bit rocky at the moment. So it's especially crucial for us to be able to actually embed and maintain that relationship with the EU. And then secondly, the JSE has just launched a voluntary carbon market. So this allows for the monetization and trading of renewable energy certificates and carbon credits. I actually just recently attended a presentation by the JSE where it was so exciting to see that they mentioned that there was a significant number of trades taking place with international buyers involved. So that opens up also another avenue for businesses to maximize on. And then lastly, in my view, beyond the numbers, brand reputation and customer loyalty, absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Current society is especially sensitive to issues around climate change, sustainability, and organizations need to be responsible corporate citizens, locally, globally, whichever environments they operate in. And I think it's to your example yesterday around the Apple and the iPhone and wanting to throw it away when it comes, time to upgrade. You sometimes sit there at a point where, and I've got family members who, I wouldn't say they're in denial, but, when you look at an Android versus an iPhone, sometimes the updates don't correlate with the price increase.
Yeah.
But it just boils down to brand reputation, customer loyalty. And I think if businesses can look at those three aspects, definitely in the medium term, they can gain that strategic advantage, or unfortunately may find themselves lagging behind and playing catch up.
Yeah. I mean, it's so true. I mean, we live in a world of something called cancel culture, and the reality is that consumers are becoming more and more aware of their choices, and it's like you can be cancelled if you are not. Not that I agree with cancel culture in a way, but when it does good for us, that's a good thing, because people and brands and companies and manufacturers need to understand that these are real risks and we need to start moving in that direction. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. Caitlin, let me bring you in. What cost saving and revenue generating opportunities actually exist for businesses that proactively invest in all of these low carbon technologies?
Thanks, Leanne. It's a great question. So in the context of this conversation, I think it's most relevant to talk about reducing your carbon tax as being kind of the main measure of cost savings. And we've spoken about how South Africa's carbon tax is maybe not quite up there in terms of the international stage. So we're a lot lower than we might need to be to really start effecting change. But we've seen massive increases already. So when South Africa's Carbon Tax Act was first promulgated, we were sitting at a carbon tax rate of 120 Rand per tonne. Now, in 2025, we're sitting at 236 Rand. So we've already doubled in 5 years. And we know that by the time we get to 2030, so in the next 5 years, it's going to effectively double again. We're going to be sitting at 462 Rand. So although we might not be quite up there in terms of magnitude, we're seeing significant increases. And that's really having a big impact on companies' operations in South Africa. Just anecdotally, we do a lot of work in the carbon tax space, and we're really seeing for the first time that businesses are starting to sit up and take notice of what they're paying in carbon tax. So at first, the first couple of years, it was sort of just kind of, all right, well, ouch, we'll pay it. But now it's really starting to get into the millions, and companies are thinking, oof, okay, well, we can't just pay this anymore. We've got to start doing something to reduce those carbon tax payments. And we also know, Mo mentioned that we are going to be entering phase 2 of the carbon tax in the next year. And we know that in addition to those carbon tax rate increases, we're going to be seeing a reduction in the allowances as well. So there's almost a double whammy there. We've got a rate increase and we've got a reduction in the allowances. And so the amount of carbon tax that is being paid by businesses is really going to shoot up.
Sure.
So when businesses are looking at reducing their carbon tax, it's really important that they have a focused and targeted reduction strategy, because we know that not all emissions are carbon taxable in South Africa. So I think kind of the knee-jerk response when companies need to reduce their carbon footprint is looking at the electricity, their scope 2 emissions, and saying, okay, well, how many solar panels can we put on our roof? How much can we reduce our electricity consumption by? But in reality, that's not going to increase your carbon tax bill, because electricity, scope 2 electricity emissions, are not taxable. And so companies really need to focus on the emissions that are taxable and weigh up and kind of pinpoint where the majority of their carbon tax liability is coming from. So if you are burning fossil fuels in your company, that's kind of the prime target for reduction opportunities. And when we are talking about reduction opportunities in terms of fossil fuel burning, the first strategy is to optimize your efficiency. So without changing anything else, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what can I do to get the most energy out of the fuel that I'm already burning? And there are a bunch of strategies there, and I don't want to get too technical today, but there are a number of things that can be done there. We then start looking at things like fuel switches. So, okay, I need process heat. I need to burn fuels in my process because I need the heat from those fuels. But maybe can I look at burning different fuels? I've always burned coal because that's what I've always done and it's readily available and fairly affordable. But can I maybe look at something else? Could I perhaps switch to burning natural gas, which has a lower carbon footprint? Oops, but we've got a natural gas cliff coming. Maybe that's not the best idea. Can I look at a different fuel, green hydrogen? Is that going to be feasible? We've heard talks about green hydrogen for years and years and years, but nothing has materialized just yet. Where are we going to be in the next couple of years? Can I look at biomass, burning wood, which is effectively carbon neutral? Okay, I can, but there are supply issues. So there really is a lot to weigh up. And that's what we always advise our clients when they're looking to reduce their carbon tax bill, is to be really strategic and to not just jump in and start reducing wherever you think you can, but to really plan it carefully and to look at a long-term strategy. And then, of course, in addition to your carbon tax savings, you'll start realizing operational savings as well. So if you're burning less fuel to generate the heat that you need to operate your factory, you're going to be paying less for fuel. If you start using wood, for example, maybe you can come to an agreement with the sawmill next door that has a lot of wood going to waste. So there are other cost-saving mechanisms that arrive when you start reducing your carbon tax. And then in terms of revenue generation, Mo, you mentioned renewable energy certificates, RECs, and carbon credits or carbon offsets. So those are kind of the two key areas in which companies can look at generating revenue from their carbon reduction measures. So just a quick explanation, both of these things can be quite complex, but renewable energy certificates, essentially when somebody generates renewable electricity, there are two aspects to that electricity. There is the physical electricity that gets used, and there is then the greenness or the green attributes of the fact that that electricity got generated renewably. And those two things can be separated out and they can be used and sold separately. So let's say you are using the sun to generate electricity. You can use that electricity, but you can sell off the green attribute of that electricity. And you can sell it to another party who then uses it to claim that their electricity that might not be from renewable resources, might be from a conventional resource like Eskom, they can claim that that electricity is green because they've purchased the green attribute or the renewable energy certificate. So that's one way that companies can monetize their carbon reduction measures. And then the other way is carbon offsets or carbon credits. And many of you might be familiar with carbon credits and carbon offsets and how they work. And it's a similar concept to renewable energy certificates, but it's broader. So essentially, you are doing an activity that either reduces greenhouse gas emissions or reduces the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And you can sell off the greenness of that project to somebody else who can then use it to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that the carbon offset market is growing. It's going to explode soon. South African carbon credits that are eligible for use in the South African carbon tax system we're short of credits. And so we're going to need more, especially considering that in phase 2 of the carbon tax, the carbon offset allowance is increasing. So currently in our carbon tax scheme, you can offset up to 10% of your emissions using carbon offsets. But in phase 2, you're going to be able to offset up to 15% of your emissions. And also as the carbon tax rate increases, the use of carbon offsets becomes more valuable and becomes more worthwhile to companies. So now is definitely a great time to start monetizing those carbon projects if you have them, or if you're thinking about them, and start generating income from your carbon reducing projects.
Sure. Okay. So I've looked at a couple of numbers and sometimes my numbers are very wrong. So I just want to look and see, and I don't know who wants to jump in. Jarredine, I'm going to try you, but if not, anybody else jump in as well. So my question is how carbon tax impacts the cost structure and competitiveness for South African companies, because this is real. We're living in a very difficult time with unemployment and companies laying off staff and not being able to afford big costs. But if we look at the carbon tax, this could cost energy-intensive sectors like mining, steel, and cement up to about 10 billion rand by 2030. The other one was saying that Sasol, as an example, which we know is our largest emitter, paid over 800 million rand in carbon tax in 2022. But obviously it's investigating how to mitigate this and try and bring in more green hydrogen and everything. It seems like a lot of money in a tough economy. What do you think?
So maybe yes or no. I mean, well, yes and no. So I think Sasol is our second largest emitter.
Who's our first?
Eskom.
Okay, I know. Those were the two that we alluded to yesterday. So it is Eskom with all the coal. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, yes, that number is huge. There are a number of allowances, that Sasol does. So it could be much higher.
Yeah.
And so, on the one hand, you do have the argument that says that the polluters should pay. These costs are currently socialized. There are many costs within society that society is having to pay. There's increased health costs because of these kind of emissions and everything. So, the polluter should be the one to pay these costs. So, yes, there is a economic impact on companies when the carbon tax increases, and that has some consequences. But doing nothing or allowing them to socialize these costs is not benign. That society does have to pay these costs. So in terms of competitiveness, one of the allowances within the carbon tax is the trade exposure allowance. And so that is a measure by which we look at the different commodities and say, what is your trade exposure? And to make sure that these companies are still competitive, especially in terms of exports, they can claim up to a 10% discount on the carbon tax because they're trade exposed. So one of the mechanisms that was put forward for phase 2 was to increase the threshold that companies would have to meet to qualify for that. And industry did push back quite significantly and did show a lot of evidence that they are already suffering economically, and it is a very difficult competitive environment. So National Treasury has actually kept that threshold fairly low until 2030. So that is one of the areas that they are keeping in place to try and help companies remain competitive. However, we do also have the carbon border tax adjustment coming into place from Europe, the CBAM, and we do have a danger where Europe could benefit from the tax. So I'm trying to explain this as simply as possible. So the CBAM says that we are taxing certain goods that we will import into the European Union, and these are carbon-intensive goods like steel and cement, as you've mentioned. And we will look to see if your country has a carbon price in place, and then you'll have to pay the difference. So I mentioned that the international rate is around $20 per ton. Ours is sitting only at about 10. So theoretically, it means that $10 per ton will have to be paid. But now Europe is going to benefit from that tax being paid. And they'll get that into their fiscus, and they can use that to help protect their industries, to subsidize their industries, to do additional research and development to help decarbonize their industries. If South Africa increased its carbon tax to an internationally competitive rate, our fiscus would benefit from that, and we could recycle those revenues within our economy. So it's not necessarily a good thing to keep our rate low for those kind of companies and those sectors that are looking to export, because that tax is going to be paid, but we won't benefit from it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, please add. Anytime you want to add, please, all of you add in.
So I think just to add on what she's mentioned now, just in terms of exposure to the EU's CBAM mechanism, I think, and the organization that I'm at Yellow Door Energy and IPP, we've just recently concluded a long-term power purchase agreement with PPC Africa in the cement industry. And CBAM was of particular concern to them as well. So it's especially crucial to be able to maintain that cost competitiveness and your advantage within the market. And again, we live in a global industry now. There's no borders, if I could call it as such. And I think the transport sector as well, that's one area where I've always been particularly concerned, because it's got fuel-related carbon tax impacts. And I think we all know that for majority of South Africans, transport costs forms a significant part of your disposable income.
Yeah.
I just read there's a monthly report that comes out, the Household Affordability Index, and in it mentioned that South Africans spend 58% of their salaries on transport costs and electricity costs.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely shocking. So ultimately, yes, polluter pays principle, but it just cascades down to the person on the street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you talk about the home user, and we've been speaking a lot about industries, but, take someone like me. If I have a penchant for these beautiful G-Class, massive cars that, are, it's big, and I've got diesel, and I've got this, and I've got that, and we're emitters as well. I mean, and I know that there are these taxes that have been added in, but is that enough? Is it enough for a consumer as well? How much do we also need to be penalized for the amount that we emit? Anyone?
So, I mean, in terms of those vehicles specifically, it really, really is a luxury, and I think there is a payment there. So,
yeah.
If you look, when you purchase a vehicle, you will see that there is an amount that's calculated, they do a calculation and they say, okay, the carbon emissions attached to this vehicle are whatever they are. And so when you purchase a vehicle, part of the tax that you pay on that purchase is for that. And then there is also the carbon tax that's levied at the fuel pump. So we pay again. Now, the only way that a car generates emissions is when you drive it.
Yeah.
And so it is almost already a double taxation. Those kind of cars, the big ones, as you mentioned, yes, they're gas guzzling and everything, but they are also largely imported, and they are classed as luxury goods. So there's a 40% tax because they're a luxury good levied, and that's part of what makes all of these things so expensive. So we do, as consumers, pay for them.
Yeah.
But I think we also do tend to have an attitude of, well, if we can afford them, with all of those taxes, and if we can afford it and we want to drive it, we will. And so the emissions are still coming in. So I think in that case, there's maybe more of a case to be made around creating incentives in the economy So how do we get people and how do we enable people to rely more on electric vehicles?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of challenges in South Africa. We're so broad and we need to set up a good charging network. Electric vehicles, it's mostly also only the high end of our kind of high end cars that have brought in an electric vehicle into the market. So they are very expensive.
Very expensive.
They're also classed as luxury goods. They also get that 40% tax as you import them. And so how can we make them more affordable, create more enabling infrastructure, and set up incentives through tax rebates or things like that to encourage people to switch to more electric vehicles like some of the Nordic countries have done.
Yeah.
So for there, in that case, I think we are a driving society. We're unlikely to change that. So we do need to create incentives to switch our passenger vehicles to electric so that we can try and avoid some of those transport-related emissions.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I remember it was just last year, I happened to drive a Volvo. So Volvo were like, listen, we're going to give you an electric car. And I drove this electric car for a while. And I actually relayed this story at a conference I did for Toyota. So I drove this car. I have never felt so nervous in my life before, because I was just convinced that I was going to break down because my battery wasn't charged, and everywhere I would go, I couldn't find somewhere to charge it. We had been thrown as a country into stage 6 load shedding. I had no electricity at home. I had a car that depended on this and nowhere to charge it. I honestly thought that I was in hell. And that's, I think things have changed. Subsequently, I know that Toyota decided they wanted to change my view on this, and they are sending me an electric car to drive for another week just to see, okay, so beware, probably the week of April the 7th, stage 6 load shedding is coming. Okay, that's probably when. But jokes aside, we are not ready as a country, and that worries, I think, the consumer, worries a lot of us, and go for it. I know you want to talk.
No, I was going to say, not only are we not ready in terms of the practicalities of driving electric cars, but we're not ready in terms of our electricity infrastructure.
Exactly.
Because the electricity is coming from coal-powered fire stations.
Yeah.
So you may as well just put petrol or diesel in your car, and you don't have the efficiency losses and all of that. And so until we have an electricity grid that is more renewably based, there's essentially no point in driving your electric cars. You're not really doing much good.
It's true.
It needs to be a just transition point. We need to remember we're a developing country. Yes, there's ambitions within the Western developed countries to say we need to transition at a faster pace, but we need to be very mindful of the needs of our society here within the country. Yeah. It's a fine balancing act that we need to.
And it's true, because we have to be very cognizant of our living conditions and where we are based on the map. It really is. But it's also interesting to see how, we depend on the EU. And I know that you were speaking about this, Mohsin, that, we are very dependent on exporting to the EU, and that's our big trade partner. And we need to ensure that we are meeting their needs. And if we keep on producing, I'm sticking in the vehicle sector. I know there's so many other sectors, but if we continue to make vehicles that they're not buying, because they're moving in this whole electric hybrid kind of way, green energy way, and yet we are not moving in that direction, that's going to hamper our economy even more. I don't know if, do you want to grab that one, anyone?
Yeah, while we're talking about the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism,
yeah,
I think it also just drives home why it's so important to start reducing your carbon emissions, not only to reduce South Africa's carbon tax, but to reduce your penalties, I assume. I guess is ultimately what it is for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So essentially what the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism says is, all right, if you had manufactured this good in Europe, you would have had to pay X in carbon taxes. But because you manufactured it in South Africa, you only paid Y. And so we want you to pay the difference. So to stay internationally competitive, we need to make sure that the difference is minimized. And so not only are you going to reduce your costs in terms of the South African carbon tax, but you're going to reduce your costs that are paid upon export of your products. And in doing so, keep yourselves competitive, because if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to sell your products for much longer.
It affects thousands of jobs, right?
Yes.
If you look at it, you've got just I just saw an article this morning, one of my colleagues shared with Ford South Africa, announcing an additional investment in terms of plug-in hybrid vehicles. So they have ambitions to stay within the country, but we also need to play our part as well. And it has a ripple effect, because if you have a factory or an assembly line that shuts down, you've got local component manufacturers that are feeding into that supply chain. So all of a sudden, one person, and I've got 4 people in my family, it affects 5 people.
Absolutely.
And it just has a massive ripple effect that I don't think as a country we can afford to just exacerbate.
No, not right now, not at all, or ever actually. It's quite interesting to see China's stance on all of this, because I see that China's carbon market covers about 4.5 billion tons of emissions, is actually pressurizing exporters to decarbonize as well. I mean, this sets up quite a big trade competitiveness and trade barriers if you do not move in this direction. If we look at something like a China market, where are they? Anyone sort of want to hazard a guess on this? Not really.
I know they're a little bit of I won't say a black hole, but maybe a grey hole.
It's interesting to read that.
And, they're so weird because, I mean, again, the statistics that you do see is, that they're still building coal-fired power plants, and this is often referenced.
Yeah.
But they are also, I mean, their renewable energy is exponential, and that's a lot of what's driven the costs down, because, again, a lot of these components for renewable energy are exported all over the world. I mean, I would flip that and say that there's enormous potential for other emerging economies and even other BRICS nations in terms of trying to remain competitiveness and around the components and that we produce for all of these things. Because if we also bring that lens of transparency into it that China doesn't have, and so you have the traceability. Yesterday you were speaking a lot about AI and the Internet of Things and blockchain and everything. If we can actually do a traceability through the entire value chain of where these different components where the ore is extracted from and how they're beneficiated and how they're developed and actually show a decarbonized value chain, that could give us a competitive advantage over even a China. So while we might be that little bit more expensive, we have that traceability and transparency. That means that we can show that greenness to European markets or others that says, rather buy these things from us.
Absolutely. And at the same time, what it can do with South Africa's carbon tax policy drive, attract investment and innovation, and people will come here. I was reading something about Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud. They're expanding their green data centers in South Africa because they're attracted by our renewable energy push. So, I mean, that shows the confidence, and obviously that's a sector for us to look at to attract more investment. Yeah.
And it opens up opportunities as well.
Absolutely.
I think the one thing we need to be mindful of is that whilst we looking as a country to solve, I wouldn't call it an issue, but solutions around carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, there's always opportunities to look at, what types of products and services one can bring to the market to actually look to sustainable practices. In my view, just the overall understanding in terms of carbon tax and its impact, to your point where you said companies weren't really taking it that seriously. I think there's still a long way to go where, even just from an advisory perspective, educating people, that can really just enable us to just get that next step ahead and obviously attract all of these foreign direct investment.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start sort of wrapping up, and I want to give each of you, a time to make a closing statement about, these issues, carbon tax, where we are as a country, what we need to up it, and just in general looking to this future of sustainability. I don't know who wants to start. Do you want to? Can I start with you, and then we'll move down?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I do think that we need to plan our carbon pricing mechanism to make sure that we do achieve the polluters pay principle. I mean, it's a very difficult balancing act. Pace and scale, this is often referred to that South Africa can afford. So yes, we do need to help protect our economy, but we also need to increase it in such a way that retains that competitiveness. Then I'd say beyond the carbon tax, or even beyond in some ways national treasury scope, we need to ensure that we have other enabling policy frameworks that do attract this investment into our economy and help us to remain competitiveness with exports to the EU and others. because I think there's enormous opportunity as we move to a greener and cleaner economy as well. So not just sort of try and protect what we have and say we need to protect this and we need to be given grace to keep polluting. Yes, we're a developing economy, but we're also the 12th largest emitter in the world. So we do need to act. But there are many, many ways that we can leverage the opportunities through that action.
Okay. Mohsin?
I think mine is a short one. I think it's just to, prepare. Keep abreast of developments locally, globally. Just last year, we had the Climate Change Act that was enacted, and I felt like it kind of floated under the radar because it gives the Minister of Environmental Affairs a lot of power that they need to use responsibly, that will cascade down to all sectors and the impact for them on carbon taxes. And yes, it's a topic now that's fairly new, if I could call it as such. But once the rands and cents are coming out of the pocket, all of a sudden then everybody sits up and takes notice. But it takes years of planning. And even if now, as an IPP, we sit and we say, okay, hey, I can get you solar energy. In a lot of cases, it takes at least a year or two to actually put that down in the ground and actually have it operational. So it's not something that you can just switch on. And can businesses actually afford to have a 2-year period where they on this bumpy road? I don't know. So I think it's just prepare.
Okay. All right. Let's get our final word, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. I think to wrap up from my side, although our carbon tax rate is still sitting well below where we might like it to be, I really do think businesses are starting to sit up and take notice. And I do anticipate a lot of change in the next couple of years. I think it's become painful enough at this point that businesses are starting to do something about it, which is brilliant. And as I said earlier, it's just really important that when designing a carbon tax reduction strategy, it's not done willy-nilly and that it's done in a targeted and strategic approach with an eye cast to the future. As you said, Mo, what is coming? So what have we got now and what is coming? And also reducing your carbon emissions is not only going to help you in the South African context, but it's going to help you in the international context as well. It's going to ensure that you remain competitive. And then also in terms of revenue generating opportunities, I also think that we're really just in the infancy of those in South Africa. We're going to see that market really starting to take off. And I think that renewable energy certificates and carbon credits are really going to become a part of everyday business language as we go forward. So yeah, that's me.
Amazing, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. A very important issue. And I think we've touched on some of the major points as a developing country and moving in this direction. Jarredine, Mohsin and Caitlin, thank you. Thank you so much. Please let's give my panelists a round of applause.